important because of tribalism. And there were attempts, perhaps within the century preceding the Prophet, to unify Arabia, which always ended in bloodshed and long-standing wars and fights. And one of these long-standing wars were happening in the city of Yathrib, to which the Prophet was invited to be a peacemaker. So, as a peacemaker and a judge and arbitrator, he became the political leader of the city. And this is quite an anomaly in the history of several religions, especially the world religions, the bigger ones. And in comparison to Christianity and Judaism, Islam was immediately politically successful. Within 100 years, the state, the Medina state, became a large empire. But the city of the Prophet, under his political leadership, unified not only believers in the Prophet, but also Christians and Jews and pagans in one community called the Ummah, the mother nation, a nation that is not committed to or does not have commitment to the tribe or commitment to the clan, but which prioritized commitment to a bigger polity, a bigger political group. And immediately after the death of the Prophet, his companions felt the Ummah is important to preserve the message of Islam. And hence political leadership is quite fundamental to the preservation of religion. So historically they chose successors to the Prophet who were called caliphs. The caliphs, or the caliphate system, went through ups and downs. And the first period was called the rightly guided caliphate. And eventually caliphate was usurped by dynastic rulers, and it has a very long history, which is not all beautiful, but the system continued for at least 1200 or 1300 years. The caliphate, despite all the problems, remained a symbol of the political leadership of the Ummah, a leadership that was committed to the message of Islam, which some Muslims refer to as Sharia, translated at times as Islamic law, but it is more than Islamic law. It's rather the moral system of Islam. So the caliphate was abolished. The last caliphate was Turkish or Ottoman, and the seat of it was in Turkey. And following the First World War, the Ottoman Empire fell apart and the caliphate was abolished. And we see in the writings of many Muslim thinkers, intellectuals, and activists in the beginning of the 20th century all over the Muslim world a serious anxiety about the abolishment of the caliphate. This was coupled with the rise of nation-states. Now, the history of nation-states in the Muslim world is very complex, and I will not try to explain it today, but some of the things that should be borne in mind is that the nation-states evolved from countries whose borders were drawn by a colonialist or by colonialist powers and colonialist agreements. Some of you who might be doing political science will have heard of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is particularly applicable to countries like Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, and some parts of Egypt as well. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the Muslim world, or parts of the Muslim world, and each Muslim community in one of these countries struggled against colonialism, and nationalism became an important discourse in the fight against the colonialists. And with independence, there was always a discussion or an issue of whether to go for a secular state or to have an Islamic state. And one could say that the majority of Muslim countries in the post-independence period chose to go for a semi-secular arrangement where religion was seen as not compatible with a modern political system, and that religion should remain within the private sphere of people or within the cultural sphere. Some Muslim countries were more aggressive in dealing with religion and its relation to politics than others. I'm going to jump to the 1970s and the 1980s, when Muslim countries see a cultural renaissance in which some call the Islamic revival or the return to Islam. It's a period that I have personally lived in several Muslim countries, including Egypt and Jordan. And during that period, political powers started to respond to the pressures to bring back Islam into the public sphere. We see this, for example, in Egypt with the rewriting of its 1971 constitution. Sharia, or Islamic law, or an Islamic framework, becomes the first source of law in the country. And by the 1980s and the 1990s, of course, many of these post-independence states were formed by the military or the officers, the military officers who were involved in the resistance movements, but were also part of the organized, the professional organized armies of the newly emerging nation states. And in many cases, the independent nation state was kept under military control. We see this in Egypt, we see this in Syria, we see this in Iraq. At different stages there were coups, and the coups evolved into totalitarian systems. The political resistance and political opposition was largely comprised of Islamically oriented people. There was, of course, a left-wing, long-standing left-wing resistance or political opposition in Arab countries, and there was an Islamically oriented opposition, and by the 1990s we saw more people who were neither left-wing nor Islamically oriented, but those who call themselves, it's a new group, a new class, who call themselves human rights activists. It's a very interesting group that I could tell you a bit more about. These groups operated in the public sphere. They put on demonstrations, and from now on I'll talk more about Egypt because this is the case study that I know extremely well. So by the late 1990s, we started to see young people who were human rights activists, who were socialists, who were Islamists or Islamically oriented, would organize small protests in different places against the state in Egypt. You must have all heard about the corruption of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, and I mean it's the old story that you've seen in Latin America and in other parts of the world. So I'm not going to tell you about that, but it's a story which includes extrajudicial imprisonment, basically depriving people of a political life. And in the early 21st century, we saw that even activism, online activism, started to attract the attention of the government, and bloggers and people who were writing on Facebook were being detained and imprisoned and questioned, regardless of their ideology or their political commitment. Jumping from that to the eve of the 25th January, which was an event provoked partly by the increasing state corruption, but also what seemed to be the plan for the future of Egypt, which is to move from a republican regime to a dynastic republican regime, which would allow Mubarak's son to rule Egypt in the same way that Syria handed over the reins of power to the son of its leader Hafiz al-Assad, and his son Bashar al-Assad is the ruler today. So on the eve of the 25th January, there were so many people in Egypt, including the army, who opposed what was called the political undermining of republicanism in Egypt. And nobody believed that we could have a revolution like the one in Tunisia, but everyone felt that it's important for Egyptians to have a kind of mass protest. So they organized a Facebook event. It's not the Facebook event that started the revolution. It was actually all the smaller activities of protest which galvanized together and unified activists who could be called Islamists and activists who were left-wing and who knew each other very well. Many of them were lawyers, many of them defended each other when the state imprisoned them or took them under, or restricted their mobility or put them under house arrest and so on. So there was already some kind of developing political movement incorporating so many people, or incorporating so many groups with different ideological commitments. So the eve of 25th of January, I saw my brother sent me the link to the page, and I saw about 40,000 or 80,000 people have joined the event. And I thought, okay, I think maybe 2,000 will go at most, and I'd be very surprised. I know that in all the previous protests that were announced, not more than 1,000 people ever appeared, and everybody knew each other. It was like a club, you know, the protest club. So in 2 hours' time, I started to see pictures of thousands of people. And that was a transformative moment. It felt like revelation. You know, heaven has opened its doors and accepted our prayers as Egyptian, and we are on the verge of revolution. I remember the next day seeing the events and seeing people break into Tahrir and continue to go to Tahrir. And of course, the bigger event was on the 28th of January, when the security forces, for the first time ever, withdrew from Tahrir Square in confrontation with the protesters. My sister was there, my brother was there, my cousins, and it was a very euphoric moment. And the next day, I sent an email around my department, which is a politics, philosophy, and religion department at Lancaster, where I'm the lecturer in Islamic studies. And I said, if you want to be up to date, let's do a seminar on revolution today. And I had a reply from a philosopher colleague who said, well, by the time you organize the seminar, there might not be any revolution left. So revolution today could be revolution yesterday. And I said, I don't know why, but I'm sure this is going to continue until the regime falls apart. And this was a kind of faith which I had not only in the Egyptian people, but also in the movements that were growing, and the movements were attracting so many young people. Now this history, and I think you might be getting a bit restless, does not mention Islam so far. But I'd like to tell you a story which is perhaps a bit nuanced and a bit more complicated than expected. Well, the first thing that happened as the system, or as the regime and the security system was falling apart, is that the most prestigious Muslim university in the world, which protects the Sunni faith, which is the majority denomination of Islam, declared joining the protest haram. So the religious ruling that came from the university, which is known as Al-Azhar, was, it's haram, don't do it. Your obligation is to protect public good, and the public good of the country is that you don't try to undermine the system, but you choose reform. And I heard what we call the fatwa, the religious ruling, on television. And immediately afterwards, I also heard the Pope of the Orthodox Patriarch, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, say something exactly similar. And I was thinking at that moment, okay, the religious establishment is siding with the regime because the regime protects it. I can understand that the religious university of Egypt, which is completely under state control, is also siding with the regime. And I started to see my newsfeed on Facebook full of prayers and people from different ideological backgrounds citing the Quran, citing that only God is the victor, that God will support the people, that God's law is where there is consensus, and there is consensus to topple the regime, and there was an alternative theological vision emerging from bottom up. So I was thinking, this is really because the establishment has a theology that wants to protect the status quo and claims that by protecting the status quo we can have a reform approach or a reformist approach. But the people on the grounds were saying that we've waited for so long, there isn't reform, and why didn't these religious institutions call upon the regime to reform itself? So we don't trust them. I'm not saying that this is the opinion of all Egyptians, but definitely this was the thought that crossed the minds of millions of Egyptians. And we had these two views represented by two major scholars in the Muslim world, who were both highly regarded 4 years ago, and who are both today extremely vilified for their political views. One of them is called Al-Bouti, and he's Syrian, who eventually sided with Al-Assad and called upon the people to support Al-Assad because revolution is a kind of chaos and temptation. You can't change injustice by breaking down the system. Breaking down the system will cause further injustices. And another very famous religious scholar called Al-Qaradawi, who started to talk about the jurisprudence of revolution. If anyone knows Arabic, it's called fiqh al-thawra. Now this sounds like both of them belonging to the same denomination, Sunni. Both of them have done traditional training in fiqh or in Islamic jurisprudence, and both of them believed in reforming Islamic jurisprudence from within the tradition, rather than that reform has to be gradual, that reform has to take into consideration both conservative and more progressive views, and you have to be moderate in your call for reform. But at the moment, or on the eve of revolution in Egypt and on the eve of revolution of Syria, both of them took what could be called very extreme views. Now the position of Al-Azhar, which represents establishment Islam, and the position of Al-Bouti, which also represents establishment Islam in both Syria and Egypt, two very important Muslim countries, is not new. There is what we call a political theology that protects the status quo in Muslim thought. And you might think all Muslims want to be militants, all Muslims want to be radicals, all Muslims want to fight injustice with the weapon, but actually the dominant view for 1200 years was to protect the community from injustice and chaos and militancy by siding with the ruler, as long as the ruler does not declare outright disbelief. So this conservatism in Islamic thought was generally the dominant view. Yes, we have a history of Muslim thinkers who actually sided with revolutionary trends within Islam. Within Islamic law, there is a small part which deals with revolution, what we call revolution or rebellion. And there's a very interesting book on rebellion in Islam by a Muslim thinker and academic called Khalid Abul Fadl, where he argues, despite the inclination to maintain the status quo because it is thought to be of greater public benefit, and sometimes when you look at what's happening in the Middle East following the Arab Spring, you might think, okay, all this chaos, all these deaths, maybe it was better to take the reformist approach rather than the revolutionary approach. Although I supported the revolution throughout, personally, when I look at the outcome, I sometimes feel I have doubts about it. So this political theology, despite this political theology of conservatism, there was always, let's say, a leeway within Islamic thought and law that if the ruler is really unjust to the extent that the injustice undermines the life of the community and there's no public benefit in maintaining him, rebellion could be justified. And there is a trend, or let's say, perhaps also in political Islamic thought, a valorization of speaking truth to an oppressor, or even if it was a Muslim ruler. And some of the early Muslim scholars and important Muslim figures of early Islam always tried to distance themselves from authority and to vilify authority when it became oppressive and take some action against it, usually action falling short of revolution and rebellion and taking up arms. So really Muslims in the square had this predominant view of Islam, but were also drawing on political movements which were Islamically oriented and which have contributed to the Islamic revival in culture. I mean, in the 1960s, some of you might know that very well. In Arab countries, if you've traveled or your parents traveled to Cairo or Beirut or Amman, in the 1960s, there wasn't one single young woman in the veil. I have pictures of my mother and grandmother in the miniskirt, which I feel very shy and I put them away. These were the urban centers of the Muslim countries, very secular. There was a kind of a religious, there was a kind of domesticated religiosity. You pray, you fast, but you don't really go into the details. You believe in God, but you don't want to know, that doesn't affect how you think about your life, your society, your politics, etc. It's in the 1980s, the political movements which adopted an Islamic ideology, which wanted an Islamic state, or which aimed to reinstate a system similar to the caliphate, which was abolished, because of a view that an Islamic society has to adopt Islam as a way of life. Islam is not just praying, doing the 5 prayers, rather it's a system. And a Muslim society can only live according to that system if the ethics of Islam are infused in the state, are infused in the educational system, and so on. So these groups attempted to change the political regime, and by the 1970s that became impossible because they were politically repressed, so they abandoned violence, or they disowned violence, and adopted a reformist agenda. These are the main political movement I'm referring to is called the Muslim Brotherhood. Does anyone know the Muslim Brotherhood in the audience? Yeah?
Not personally.
Yes? Okay. So the Muslim Brotherhood adopted a reformist ideology and started to work more in the social and cultural sphere. And that had a huge impact on Muslim society. And by the 1980s, 1990s, there was almost a surge in Islamic ethics in the public. And then if you have gone to Egypt in the late 1990s, perhaps 8 out of 10 women were in the veil. 8 out of 10 young people were involved in some kind of Islamic activity in public. So Islam became very much an important dimension of life and society in the late 1990s and the early years of the 21st century. So in Tahrir Square, back to the eve of the 25th of January revolution, there were 2 views, okay? Do you follow the fatwa or the religious ruling of the establishment? It's an obligation to leave Tahrir, or do you follow the ruling or the ethos of politically or Islamically oriented political groups which believed and which supported Tahrir Square that this is the right moment to change the regime? And I feel that many people did not think through that very much. Many people felt that they were fed up. I don't think there was a lot of theological discussion going on in people's heads at that time. But there were these 2 choices available to people. And what we saw afterwards is that ideology was put on the shelf in the 18 days during which the protests continued in Tahrir Square. But we saw something else which was really interesting, and I think it was due to the impact of the revival we saw, or which took place in the 80s and the 90s. The religious routine was extremely important to the protests. So we saw massive congregations of people praying in the square. The revolution became concomitant to spirituality. There were many, actually the language of the people in the square was more spiritual and Islamic than I've ever heard amongst activists before. Even the human rights activists who generally prefer a secular political paradigm and the socialists, everybody was praying to God in order to support the protesters in their fight against Mubarak, peaceful fight. And the terminology that came from the Islamic religious tradition, one key term is the term shaheed, which means martyr. So all of those killed by the security apparatus in Cairo were called shuhada, even if they were Christians, by the way. So even the Copts were called shuhada. There were moments when people felt, especially on the day in early February, there was, you must have seen this on television, or I do urge you to look it up on YouTube if you can. The security apparatus, which failed, tried to send some thugs on camels. And I was thinking, okay, this is Orientalism. It must have been, they must have been reading Lawrence of Arabia and bringing back the camels into the scene. It was very strange to choose the camels and the horses to go into the square to separate or to break down the protest. But anyway, there is a social history to this. Thank you. There are a lot of thugs around the area of the pyramids. If you've gone there as a tourist, thuggery is located there. Okay, so on that eve, the Battle of the Camel, as we call it, failed to break down the protests. But they expected a fight in the night. And I called some friends in Tahrir Square, and I called my brother, and they said they've received information, because they had supporters on the inside, that they are going to be attacked. And that the Muslim Brothers organized, the Muslim Brothers are the most organized, and still are the most organized political movement in Egypt. The Muslim Brothers are starting to organize the defense. And at some moment, everybody in Tahrir Square started crying, Ya Rab, which means it's a calling upon God to help them, to support them. And it was such a huge, the acoustics, just hearing it on Al Jazeera, I was 24 hours glued to Al Jazeera, just hearing it on Al Jazeera made me feel that this is not just a political protest, this is a renewal of a common spirituality in the civic sphere. This is not necessarily Islamic, although it uses Islamic language, but it's a deeper faith that has come of the Islamic revival, Egyptian spirituality, but also the potency of the language. People chose the religious language over any other language, or chose a religious spiritual language over any other language to express their anxieties, to deal with their fear. And I've seen this myself 10 months later when I went to join a protest near the ministerial cabinet following the attack on women, which included the attack on the blue bra girl, if you remember her. A woman in the face veil was completely, she was thrown on the floor by the military police, and her clothes were torn off her body. I don't know if you remember that, or if you've seen it. And this was reported on all the Western news outlets, and she was called the blue bra girl because she preferred that her identity wouldn't be revealed. So a lot of women, a lot of academics, Egyptian academics and activists from all over the world went back to Egypt to join that specific protest. And on one of the evenings, it started to rain. There was a protest and it started to rain heavily. And as it rained heavily, people, I don't know where they got the idea from, they had long plastic sheets and everyone pulled the plastic sheets together and stood underneath them and started again praying to God. And I had some Coptic friends with me, and they were all praying for God's support. And believe me, it was one of the most moving moments I've experienced in my life. That kind of religious language, which is Islamic and very familiar, is a language that so many people are using in a heartfelt way, even though they may be Copts or secular human rights activists and so on. And I felt that Islam is embedded in Muslim societies more than any ideology, more than any other perhaps cultural paradigm. Westernized women without any veil, who were completely educated in Western systems such as the American university or international schools, felt that this is the language that expresses them best as they are joining in the protests. So that doesn't mean that there weren't different views about what Islam, in the aftermath, what Islam should be doing, or what is the role of religion in the political sphere. But I want to show you some pictures because I've been talking at you for a long time. This is a picture of at least 2 million people prayer, which happened 1 week after the 18-day revolution. So this was just 1 week after Mubarak was toppled. And it was a prayer that was led by Sheikh al-Qaradawi. And it was a Friday ceremony that he delivered, in which he called upon all Egyptians. He addressed not only a Muslim congregation, but he also addressed a Christian and secular and atheist people in Egypt coming together. So he was recognizing that religion, or Islam, has the ability to transcend ideology and could offer a spiritual realm even in political action for many people who are not necessarily Muslims or committed to Islam. It's even, that ceremony was, even by the detractors or those who critique Qaradawi for being too politically oriented and supportive of the Muslim Brothers, said it was one of the historic ceremonies in Muslim, Arab and Egyptian history. How can I?
And there's a keypad underneath your desk. Sorry, just a keyboard even.
Okay, thank you. This is a picture I took myself of a Friday prayer, and it shows that not the whole square necessarily prayed. There was always space for prayer, and the square, at the center of the square, was a kind of sacred space which changed functions at different times, but which was also always available for people who wanted to pray. And they prayed in the dozens, in the hundreds, in the thousands, and sometimes in the hundreds of thousands. And it was a moment, as people sometimes refer to the Muslim prayer, as a unifying experience, because you stand next to each other without any class distinction, any ethnic distinction, although there is gender segregation, and I know that most mosques have this segregated spaces. However, women, who are a very important part of the 25th of January event and what followed it, and not just veiled women, but also women of different colors, different commitments, ideological commitments, you saw the congregation in the square, even transcending gender segregation. So some of the very conservative women would stand in the front rows, and behind them the men. This is due to the ad hoc arrangements of the prayer, but it tells you that something so important to conservative expressions of Islam, which is gender segregation during the prayer, even that was transcended as the moment, because at that moment gender didn't matter, ideological commitment didn't matter, and prayers were one way in which, the Muslim prayers were one way in which people came together and expressed both their political and spiritual self. As I said, the Tahrir Square included so many people, men and women, people of the middle class, the upper middle class, and the lower middle classes, and the distinctions were not clear, and there was no one leader to the event. So the event was far more organic and fluid, and the spirituality and religious language, which was Islamic, was expressed in a much more fluid way. This is a picture of one of the people who were later vilified, or everyone who participated, religious or not, was later vilified, who wrote a message of peace on this banner. People used to go with banners during the day and put a message on that banner. This was almost a ritual that developed from the first few days of the Tahrir Square protest. This message refers to certain Quranic verses. The person himself doesn't belong to any political Islamic movement, and I've asked him whether he belonged to the mystical tradition of Islam, and he said no. And he said, I'm just a rural person who cares so much about Egypt. And the banner, which says for peace, or for the sake of peace, talks about justice, talks about the parliament, and says that the slogan should be La ikrah, which in English could be translated as there's no compulsion, with no compulsion. And that comes from the Quran, chapter 2 of the Quran, which has a verse that says, no, there's no compulsion in religion. And then mentions that the examples that we should follow include Prophet Muhammad and Prophet Jesus. So you saw different Islamic messages also in the square. Not all of them necessarily would fit how we understand Islam in the modern world or in Egypt. Usually as academics we say, okay, that's traditional Islam, that's political Islam, or that's Islamism, that's Salafism, and we have these clear categories which in the square were completely transcended and destabilized. People from different groups actually acted in ways that were unexpected. There's a lot to say about what happened afterwards, and I want to give you a chance to ask questions, but of course things did not work out the way people wanted. Ideological divisions started to appear, and the ideological divisions emerged mainly in relation to how to proceed. Should we continue with revolutionary action to dismantle a corrupt regime? And many radical revolutionaries, or many of the young activists who participated in the Tahrir Square, felt that they want to press on with revolutionary action. And this is when they fell out with the Muslim Brothers who said that's enough, and let's try to reform the regime by working with the regime and working with the military. And the society got polarized afterwards, and we had a coup, and the Islamists were terribly repressed and massacred. There were 2 horrible massacres in August 2013, which led to the death and burning, and all the horrible things that you would expect in a mass massacre. I think the toll was about 4,000 people. But if there's anything that I'd like to stress here, is that there were 2 views which within people who claim that their commitment is to Islam. First, one is that Islam supports a jurisprudence of revolution, and the revolution should press on, and others who supported reform and gradual reform in the post-18 days action, and that divided society hugely, and to a great extent, because the Muslim Brothers were the largest organized Islamic group, and they adopted reform many activists and many ordinary people in society associated Islam with the reformist inclination and started to condemn them as having sold out to the military and using religion to justify their actions, and this kind of rise in a secularist position on things in the Arab Spring countries. But I'm not too alarmed, despite the calls of anxious Muslims in Egypt that atheism is on the rise after what the Muslim Brothers did, or secularism is gaining grounds amongst our young people. Because what I saw in Tahrir is that Islam has much deeper roots than any ideological interpretation. There are also fears and anxieties that the repressed young people of the Muslim Brothers are going to join ISIS because ISIS is powerful. ISIS does not adopt a useless peaceful strategy like the Muslim Brothers, who were in the end killed and massacred. So there is a fear that the young people of the Muslim Brothers will all go to ISIS and support radical violent movement. I think that too is inaccurate, and I think that Islam is really at the root of many Arab cultures with large Christian minorities, and that many Christians, whether they know it or not, have actually imbibed Islamic culture, Islamic concepts, and that when at certain moments it becomes a unifying element in society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shuruq, for your talk. A really great insight into the role that Islam had to play in politics, especially in the Arab Spring. Something that I didn't know, and I think something that all of us can learn from. That religion does have a space to play in the political sphere, and Shuruq, thankfully today, told us how it did play a role. So now the floor is open for any questions. Okay, go for it.
You want me to set into that, or should I just...
Just say your question.
I can go for me. Okay, just wanted to say it was a really informative talk, and made it very clear for people who weren't necessarily as well versed in Middle Eastern politics. Just with regards to one of the early points with about the Sunni universities being propped up by the state, do you think that it is... Okay. Well, I'll just repeat in case anybody didn't hear it. With regards to the earlier point about Sunni universities being propped up by the state and protected, do you think that it is then problematic in the Egyptian case for the state to have almost a monopoly on Islamic interpretation, especially when it's so strong at a ground root level?
Yes, the state is trying to nationalize Islam in Egypt. The Azhar University itself has been nationalized about 60 years ago. In the middle of the 20th century, some of you might know that Islam doesn't have a church. It has a mosque, but the mosque is just a functional space. But it doesn't have a church hierarchy, and it doesn't have a pope. But the authority, the locus of authority, or the center of authority in Islam, lies with the community of scholars and their religious legal schools. So the authority never resides with one person, and over the centuries there were prestigious colleges and institutions of religious learning which became authoritative, but not the center of authority as such, and no one person was generally given any theological primacy over anyone else. Some Muslim religious scholars were appointed as state bureaucrats, or the top of the bureaucratic hierarchy in the pre-modern world. They became known as Shaykhul Islam, but that was a bureaucratic position more than being a theological position. So Al-Azhar and most of these colleges which became prestigious basically were funded by private endowments. And it's interesting to tell you also, and I hope you might want to know more about that, and I'd be happy to tell you, that many of these endowments were made by women. So basically the main religious scholars lived off the money of the women. in Muslim society, who set up the colleges, set up the sponsorships, the scholarships, and so on, the shelters, etc. So these colleges had huge endowments, including Al-Azhar. In the 1960s, Egypt, under the military rule of the free officers who basically made Egypt or helped Egypt to seek independence from the British, peaceful resistance it was for part of the time. They nationalized everything because they adopted a socialist ideology. But in the middle of that nationalization period, they also nationalized the religious institutions. And there was some resistance to that because the endowments are not private property. The endowments are supposed to serve the community at large, and here it's serving the scholarly community of Islam. So that nationalization meant that all of the religious scholars who worked for that university were state employees. Eventually, of course, state control increased, and that's problematic. But also, around the second half of the 20th century, we saw many people from outside the religious establishment gain religious knowledge and challenge the monopoly of the traditional religious scholars. So the state could never have monopoly over state religion, or over the religious establishment, because the religious establishment started to open up to actors from outside these colleges. What's happening today is something unprecedented, and we don't know where it's going. With the Azhar teaming up with the military state, they are basically outlawing any other voice, which means that the religious establishment will always be reflecting the agenda of the political regime. They are financially dependent on the state. They are, in terms of their authority, in terms of the appointments, and a lot of other institutional and structural issues, they are dependent on the state. So, yeah, there is a danger in which even religion is being nationalized in a country like Egypt.
Thank you.
Thank you for your answer, Shuruq. So, we're getting great, we just had a great answer, so please ask some more questions. Our other Egyptian ISOC member.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just have two comments and a question. First comment is I really like, first of all I'm Egyptian, so, and I really like that you spoke about the idea of nationalizing religion and how basically after the caliphate and so on, in a way all these semi-secular regimes, what they did is just take everything that's bad about the idea of organized religion and how using religion to push certain political ideas, and they pretty much just try to abolish spirituality and everything that's actually important and actually touches people's lives in a good way from our societies. So I really like that you spoke about this, and just wanted to know your opinion about the idea of these extreme radical Islamic groups in a way benefiting the regimes, and if you think that in some way these secular ruling groups or the military sometimes use them to justify what they're doing, and to justify, for example, like in Egypt, how they often claim that they're fighting war and terrorism, and that Muslim Brotherhood are equivalent to ISIS and so on. So what's your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that? And also,
I agree with you.
You agree with me? And the Muslim Brotherhood, you mentioned that basically they pretty much decided to adopt a more working with the military, trying to reform things. This didn't work out very well for them, clearly. So would it have been better for them to stand with other people who said, no, we need to keep fighting them until the military falls down, because the military is the problem, and the military are the ones who are pretty much in control of all of Egypt? Would that have been a better approach, and how could that have worked? What is the alternative? What are the main mistakes that happened that could have been avoided? I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you very much. These are very perceptive questions, and I really appreciate them. On the point of Islamic groups being used by the government, I'm not an advocate of the conspiracy theory, although I have to say that ISIS sometimes tests the limits of my resistance to conspiracy theory. But that aside, yes, Islamic groups, politically oriented Islamic groups, have been used by the state, not necessarily because these groups were complicit with the state, but for example, when Egypt was being transformed from a socialist regime, a socialist during under Nasser system, to an open-door capitalist system, in order to crush the left-wing activists and the left-wing politicians, Sadat, who became president of Egypt in 1971, opened up the door or the gate to Islamic groups to have a role in society. So they were used against the socialist political class, so to speak. That's one example. Not that they were in bed with the government, but they realized or they recognized an opportunity and used it. There's also the example of the ultra-conservative groups who sometimes refer to themselves as the Salafi movement, and the Salafi movement is really very difficult to define because it has many trends within it, different groups and subgroups and so on. But during the 18 days, the majority of Salafis refused to support the revolution. In general, they adopted the political theological view that it's better to maintain the status quo. But immediately after that, they wanted a political share. And in the end, they sided with the regime against the Muslim Brothers because many of them sided with the military against the Muslim Brothers because they thought that would give them greater, a freer hand in society, and they, with the vacuum created by the departure of the Muslim Brothers, they might have a greater influence on society. So yes, these groups are often used or are often exploited by a regime which oppresses everybody all of the time or most of the time. So if there's an opportunity, not just the Islamists or the Islamic groups, but also the other groups. I mean, we have old parties in Egypt which also jump at the opportunity of the government, putting its hand out with, come and help us with something. So they will fill in the space if they are given the chance. And this is to do with the corrupt politics and corrupt political life that we have in Egypt. So this is one question answered. Sorry, I forgot what.
The other one was about what are the alternatives? Like, should the Muslim Brotherhood have adopted a more radical approach of just continuing the revolution, staying in the streets, protesting, and trying to topple down the entire military regime?
At the time when the Muslim Brothers were withdrawing from the street and not supporting the protests, and it was interesting because some of the activists, or many of the activists, were calling for what we know in the Islamic terminology as qasas, which is retribution. It's a word, it's a technical word that comes from the Quran, there are several chapters on it in Islamic legal books. Qasas means retribution for, all sorts of crimes and torts. But many people started to use this word widely, regardless of ideology or religious affiliation, to refer to the need to restitute justice in Egypt, especially retribution for the killing of, hundreds of people during the 18 days. The toll of, the toll so far is maybe more than 12,000 people were killed in the last 4 years in Egypt. And still qasas or retribution or justice hasn't been restored. So the Muslim Brothers were accused of undermining the qasas process by basically becoming complicit with the regime in order to, because the military gave them promises to support in elections in which they would participate. And they knew that this was their opportunity to come to power for the first time in their history in Egypt. So they thought that was a very important opportunity that they don't want to waste, and I think they made the wrong choice. But in hindsight, had they made the other choice, would have things changed? I think that the military would have found a way of also coming back to power. It's a very difficult question. The state in Egypt is not a state as you know it in the West. It's oligarchy from bottom up. It's corrupt from bottom up. Really, to dismantle all of this, you need to dismantle society, because everybody is complicit in some way or another. There's no revolution that's going to re-educate the whole Egyptian people. The state bureaucracy has a few million employees. All of them are part of the corrupt system. Egypt is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So it's difficult. How could you have dismantled all of this? How could you have dismantled the military? So I'm not sure. In hindsight, had they gone down the justice now against everybody in the government, if that would have worked. That was a more radical position, which was not necessarily Islamic. It was the human rights activists, the left-wing activists. They wanted revolutionary courts in the square. They wanted death sentences against the military police and death sentences against the police. And it was, surprisingly for many people who don't know the Middle East, it was the Islamists who did not want mass killings and mass punishments, and they were much more conservative and reformist in that sense. They wanted to include as many people in the post-revolutionary process. I think it's, in hindsight, whichever way it would have gone, we would have ended up with a military coup.
Any more questions?
Another Egyptian?
No.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just asking, you just mentioned a minute ago that Egypt is corrupted from top and bottom. So do you think that the revolution would fail anyhow, and it was wrong really to have a revolution because you cannot really educate people, and maybe we need to educate them one by one or anyhow instead of this revolution? This is the first question. The second question, did the Arabic Spring fail? Thank you.
Okay. I wouldn't take a black and white position on any of these questions. I think the Arab Spring countries, Arab people were bound to go through a process of change which was going to be painful. The status quo was unsustainable. I mean, it was going to collapse anyway. It was going to lead to economic collapse, social collapse. That kind of totalitarian regime that we had in post-independence Arab countries, which attempted to impose a nationalist discourse which did not consider or give any real consideration to the diversity, religious, ethnic, whatever, of their societies, crushing all the voices which threaten it by having an alternative vision. That is unsustainable. It was going to lead to violence, whether Islamic or not. My view is that the likes of ISIS, which ISIS is shocking the world, but believe it or not, ISIS is the mirror image, in my view, of the secular Arab regimes that we had. Who started the burning? Assad started the burning, started the mutilations. The military coup burned people alive in the makeshift hospitals. I saw people burned alive. I heard reports by doctors who were on the square about the brutality of these regimes for decades have led, it has made violence part of life. So when you get used to, when you become socialized in a system that is politically violent, that's what you learn, regardless of ideology. And of course, I mean, I have my reservations against considering ISIS part of the political, part of the history of political Islam. I think it's a mutation. It's a mutant, definitely. And I don't think it has any solid theology of resistance or jihad or anything of the like. But more or less, it reflects it reflects the vacuum which was created by political regimes which for 50 years corrupted our political life, but also emptied it of any real content. So young people were advised by their parents for decades to, to use the Arabic phrase or the particularly Egyptian phrase, walk next to the wall. Otherwise, you lose your life. And it was more acute in Syria than in Egypt, or more acute in Iraq than under Saddam than in Egypt. But even after Saddam, it's still extremely dangerous. That's not to exclude that there are regional actors who also want instability, who want the revolutions not to work. Now, did the Arab Spring fail? I don't think the Arab Spring failed. I think maybe those involved in the Arab Spring were very idealistic about and very romantic about an expectation of great changes happening in the next 2 years, and thinking that these regimes will not try to resist because, large sectors of society are embedded in the systems and in the institutions. So for them, it's a matter of life and death, and facing courts and facing trials and calling for justice undermines important sectors of society. It's not just Mubarak. It's Mubarak and perhaps a couple of million people. It's not just Assad. It's Assad and his Alawi sect. These people face serious dangers to the. So it's a life and death fight. Now, the important thing is that large sectors of the Muslim youth, like yourselves, at the university, at schools, even younger, have grown up with, or are growing up to see themselves playing a role in history. I think that's a huge success. And they are not despairing, and they are not giving up like the generations, the older generations. It's one of the tropes today in our political life or revolutionary circles is that, anyone 50 and plus, or even 40, well, 50 plus, don't count on them. They are part of the ancien regime, the ancient regime. They will say it's better to walk next to the wall. Now, 50 and under are thinking that their political role in society is so important because they could see that they managed to change history in some moments. Yes, it hasn't gone the way they wanted, but they could have an impact. And believe it or not, having an impact in real life and not living a marginal, individualistic kind of life is so important for many people in the Arab world. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
To an extent.
Alex, yeah.
Could you explain what was so different for Tunisia? And is democratization one of the only answers? Because there'll always be, not always, but there's likely to be corruption in any regime. So the only way to get full representation is democracy.
So what's different in Tunisia?
Why did it succeed?
I don't claim an insider's perspective on Tunisia, but I can tell you my impression from my conversations with Tunisian activists and Tunisians I know. Well, firstly, like Egypt, the initial experience of the revolution was a unifying experience, and then as people started to think about what kind of political system do we want to have, how are we going to reform, what is the role of religion in the next stage, all of these questions led to divisions and even polarization. And with the rise of polarization in Egypt and the attack on the media vilification of the Muslim Brothers, the media is largely controlled by the state. So some people, describe it as a counter-revolutionary campaign against the Muslim Brothers, building on serious mistakes, but nevertheless, anti-Muslim Brotherhood propaganda was part of a counter-revolutionary campaign. In Tunisia, they had a similar campaign, but the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which is called Al-Nahda in Tunisia, or the revival, was perhaps, how do I put this diplomatically? They were more intellectually apt. They were also they were highly educated, so the leader of the movement, Rashid al-Ghanouchi, is actually someone who's lived here for a long time, is an intellectual. I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood, it had many businessmen, experts in the sciences, but not intellectual, not thinkers. So al-Ghanouchi was aware of the pitfalls of insisting on remaining in power. So he developed a discourse in which the Muslim Brothers were able to withdraw because they prioritized national interests, and they were able to withdraw before the society collapsed because of polarization. I think they were more tactful, more politically apt, maybe because of their intellectual openness. Tunisia is a smaller country. The level of development and education is higher than Egypt. There are many reasons why I think things did not fall apart in the same way in Tunisia. Does that answer your question?
You said earlier how one of the many problems facing Egypt is its economy. How do you feel like the Muslim Brotherhood would be able to respond to that problem?
How are they planning to respond to that problem?
Yeah, how effective do you think they'll be able to manage it? Because
there was, of course, no magical recipe, and the economic problems surfaced immediately. Egypt lives off aid, and mainly aid coming from the Gulf countries. So during the time of the Muslim Brotherhood, the short period in power, they depended on Qatar. And then when the military coup happened, they depended on the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So there has to be, someone to fill in the shortage in the budget. However, they claim they had an economic plan, which they also called it Nahda, the revival of Egypt's economy, which wanted to create economic alliances with countries like Turkey, China. But they didn't have a chance to develop these plans. My view is that the Muslim Brotherhood, in terms of social organization, they were great. They organized themselves very well. For years or decades, they provided the welfare system which the government could not provide, but mainly because of their business and their own private resources, and maybe resources from other members of the Muslim Brotherhood outside Egypt. But in general, they lacked a real grasp of the economic problems in Egypt, and they did not have a clear ideology about how they want the economy to go. In the 1960s, the Islamic movements were very much socialist and left-wing in calling for social justice, wealth distribution. But the Muslim Brothers of the 1990s and early 21st century, they were very much in line with capitalism. They did not want to undermine the system. Many of them are tycoons or in the leadership. There were some business tycoons like someone called Khayrat Shatir. So they were going to continue the liberal capitalism, which would have led, I think, to more social injustices and more economic injustices in Egypt. And I don't think Egypt, regardless of who's ruling since the 1971 change of ideology, has any serious or has had any serious revision of how of its vision for the future. It's still it still remains within the liberal and open door policy of Saddam, which is going to cause more economic problems.
Any more questions?
Yes, I've been waiting for that question for 20 minutes now.
Yes, I want to agree on a point that once I I'm from Libya, and once I spoke to extremists, and most of the argument he had with me was like, it's about a conspiracy, and he didn't really have good points when it comes to Sharia law. So that's to agree.
A member of the Muslim Brotherhood?
No, he was from Ansar Sharia. It's classified as a terrorist organization, the West. The guy who was, and most of the argument he had was that it's a conspiracy. We have to fight them. We have to.
In Egypt?
No, in Libya.
In Libya.
Yeah. At the second point, you spoke with him about I forgot which one.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's been this long.
Do you think that Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt were forced to act this way, not like the Tunisian ones, like in Nahda? Because the army kind of in Tunisia accepted what's gonna happen, while Egypt didn't. Same goes for Libya and Syria. The third point, what do you think the Islamists, what are gonna do for the Gulf state in the future? Islamic politician. Do you think something's gonna happen?
Sorry, what's the last point?
Gulf state, Islamic politician. Do you think we're going to have a role in the future in this?
The Gulf states?
Yeah. Movements and improvement in the political reforms in the Gulf states.
Are we going to see political reforms in the Gulf states?
Through Islamic movement?
Through Islamic movements? Okay. I'm not a fortune teller.
No, but I think what you got.
I wish. I'll try to answer. I'm not sure I fully understood your first point. But if you're talking about people who claim to belong to Islamic groups and to support Sharia, and then when you talk to them, you discover that they understand very little about Sharia. That's a very common problem, and this is due to one major reason is that we don't have religious literacy in the modern Muslim world in the same way that we had in the pre-modern Muslim world. So the religious sciences are no longer part of the ordinary educational system. People are still very committed to Islam, but the secularization of education meant that the religious knowledge became professionalized, when in the past it was far more accessible to all people. Religious knowledge was given in the mosque, was given in the religious colleges, and people could take part in the sessions of learning, and so a lot of people had a degree of religious literacy, perhaps far more than university graduates today. So I think there is a kind of religious illiteracy, a widespread religious illiteracy, even amongst Islamic movements. Although I know movements like the Muslim Brothers are very keen on, before you join them, you have to go through a rigorous educational program. But that rigorous educational program also regurgitates fixed ideas, or some fixed ideas about what Islam is and what Sharia is, that are not necessarily reflective of the diversity of the Islamic tradition. So my view is that people are still committed to Islam, romantic about what that commitment could bring about in society. So if you're committed to Islam and you're supporting Sharia, and Sharia is the system or the paradigm of your society, legally, politically, etc., we're going to have justice and peace on earth, and everything is going to be great. But I think they don't realize that there are problems that we need to be thinking about within the Sharia system, because the Sharia is largely made up of interpretations of human beings. What they thought, to the best of their efforts, is God's law. But none of the great, wonderful jurists of the past says this. What I say is God's law. So what we know of Sharia is basically the jurisprudence that Muslims produced. So many Muslims who are committed to retrieving Islam in the public sphere, in the political system, in our cultural life, know little about Islam, and also have very romantic views about what the transformation that Sharia could bring to society. There is no way around the difficult problems like gender or other things, you know. So that's one point. Does that answer? What's the second point?
The Muslim Brotherhood were forced to take this.
Yeah, I think the Muslim Brotherhood are part of Egyptian society, and they are more Egyptian than the Egyptians think, in that they are they don't have the cultural exposure to thought that is different to theirs. Not like the Nahda movement in Tunisia, which was basically having dialogues and conversations with great secular thinkers, you know, having interreligious dialogues and going around the world, having that kind of cultural and intellectual exposure. I think the Muslim Brothers, because of the repression, the political repression, were very much absorbed into the dynamics of maneuvering the Egyptian regime, and that led to building up their finances, and I think that led to a certain bankruptcy in their intellectual capital. But that's my personal view, and I feel very. I always like to be very careful and mindful of my criticism of the Muslim Brothers from an ethical point of view, that they are at a moment of severe repression, and maybe it's not the time to critique them severely, but yeah. I think, yeah, they played a part in what happened to them.
Any more questions?
Any third point? I can't remember it now. Or does that answer?
No, so like the reforms in the Gulf state, but you said, you know.
The reforms in the Gulf state. I think that's important. I think the Gulf state, all of the Gulf states, apart from Qatar, were extremely alarmed by the Arab Spring, because any success to democracy in large countries or important countries such as Egypt, Libya, Syria, would mean that, you know, one of the things that also emerged at the time of the Arab Spring in 2011, maybe some of you have seen this on television, on the Fridays in January and February and March, you would see Al Jazeera would show the Friday ceremony from all the key squares where revolution was taking place. And you could see that people were talking to each other across the borders about the need to change the regime, and that if it changes in Egypt, then it has to change in Libya, then it has to change in Syria. The Gulf people were listening, and you wouldn't be able to, you could bribe them, the regime bribes people. In the first few months of 2011, I think the late King Abdullah gave bonuses to the whole Saudi nation up to 30 billion riyals, if I remember correctly. But you can't bribe people to, you know, to live materialistic lives, especially in the Gulf country. There are classes of highly educated people who would want eventually some political agency in their society. And listening to these calls from the protest squares in other Arab countries, they would be thinking, okay, we're capable of doing that. I think most Arab Gulf countries played a huge role in the counter-revolutionary wave that we saw in 2012 and 2013. And it's not a coincidence that Saudi Arabia took an interest in supporting the military coup in Egypt, and with money and you know, everything, including intelligence. But we will see a reform. I think they will collapse in the end. It is another unsustainable status quo. Arab societies are developing, evolving, and things have changed. I don't think we're going to go back to the acquiescence that we saw in, you know, that have been the mark of the 60 years following the abolishment of the caliphate.
Have we got any more questions? None. Okay, I've got one question. Like, you know, you said you had pictures of the women in your family dressed in a certain way. In my family also, my granddad asked my grandma to take off her hijab and start wearing sleeveless sari blouses. And then she eventually did that. Then why do you think people in the 1960s sort of left religion at that point in time? And another question is, you said that it was the secular states who actually started burning people alive and doing these horrific crimes. Do you think it was because these political institutions were so far from religion that it caused them to do such horrific things?
So why did people secularize?
Yeah, in the 1960s and in that time period.
It's very difficult to reduce social and political phenomena into one explanation. I think a very quick explanation from the Egyptian context is the religious discourse, with the nationalization of the state, the professionalization of religious knowledge. The religious discourses were under house arrest. If we can use a metaphor, that was it. The state secularized societies through education, so there were generations who were oblivion to many aspects of religion, complete religious illiteracy, until we saw in the 1960s a new class of preachers who were not produced by the state, who were finally catching up with the people, middle class professionals who were taking an interest in religion because of political failures of the secular state, the demise of Muslim peoples everywhere, political demise, the fact that most Muslim countries became clients of Western countries or Western powers was also one reason why people were thinking, okay, we're just followers and maybe we should look for something authentic. It was a kind of existential, not only a political crisis, but also existential crisis. So my father's generation, my father was born in the 30s, in the 40s he was a Marxist. Most of his friends were communists. In the 1970s they started to develop a kind of Islamic communism, or Islamic Marxism. And by the 1980s, they were all in the late 50s and starting to feel this is the end of their life and becoming spiritual. So there was a sense in which the political regime failed, the different ideologies are problematic and failed, and that there was a call for a more authentic, non-Western. This became a very important, concept that we taba'iyya, or being followers, or being, culturally and politically dependent on other civilizations. And I think we have a psychologist here, Sadia, I think is a psychologist. There is a sense in which people look for identity and try to construct an identity which expresses them, and realize that a manufactured identity that does not express their heritage, their past, who they are, their culture, their language is problematic. I think there are multiple reasons and possible explanations. But also the intelligentsia of the 1940s and the 1950s was approaching its later years, and they all, sort of turned Muslims again. Many of my father's friends started praying at the age of 50 and started to feel more religious, and started to try to reconcile between their past ideologies and their newfound religion. And as I said, there was a new class of preachers also emerging in Muslim societies. And in the late 1990s we saw televangelists who wore suits and spoke fluent English, fluent French, and talked about one famous one is called Amr Khalid. He's Egyptian but globally known, and especially in the Arab world. They started talking about personal development, human resources, managerial approaches, and Islam. So having objectives, motivation theories and Islam and things like that. That caught on also in the younger generations who were seeing their parents go back to Islam, but not completely grasp the key religious concepts. So these preachers had the later generation sort of get to grips with more, with deeper aspects of Islam. But there's no easy or simple answer to your questions.
We're going to have to leave shortly because Shuruq's train is at 8:40. But I think we're going to get Kate's coming in a few seconds. So, and then I think if Shuruq's comfortable, she could just stay here about 5 more minutes so people can come and talk to you personally. And lastly, thank you everybody for coming. It's because of everybody who's come this week that we've been able to hold the Discover Islam Week. It's because of your support. It's because of the fact that you come to the events. Also, if anybody has missed any events throughout the week, they will be online next week, inshallah, on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page. Thank you for coming. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.